Um, we're catching up from last week on the conversations with Brecht, and then we will kind of try to do a deep dive into at least some of the key sections of the Paris exposés. So they're all there's a bunch of mini essays, and I'd like to give them some justice, the different topics. Let's see what else we might have neglected from last time. Oh, Convolute D. Convolute D, that's right. So we actually have to catch up on Convolute D as well as on the conversations with Brecht. And then we'll get into the Paris expositions. Yeah, I had a feeling that we had a lot on our plate. All right, so we do have one final class session next week. I think that Pablo told me that he's not going to be able to attend, but I hope you guys are able to attend. It's because we're the Monday class. That's right. That's right. He did ask about that. So if we can do that, that'll be cool. Yeah. So hopefully it's not too much of an inconvenience because we do want to make it to the end. We do want to make it to the whole purpose of the course, which is to read the theses on the philosophy of history or on the concept of history, as well as the Paralipomena, those the unincluded little draft sections. Yeah, we've been building the whole course towards this, right? So we want to actually get there. And Convolute N, you'll see, is going to be important in thinking about the question of progress, historical progress. The real target of Benjamin's essay is faith in progress, assumption of progress, assumption of historical progress, which we have a hard time not doing, not assuming historical progress. We assume that we are morally and intellectually superior than people in the past, and what if we're not? What if capitalism makes us regress, in fact? So we're going to get into some of the substance of that this week. All right, so conversations with Brecht. So this is part of, I include this because this is part of giving us just the historical situation. Since we're in the Arcades project now for a little bit, we've been dealing with Benjamin's Arcades project. The contemporary political situation, the contemporary historical situation that is motivating the Arcades project, and all of the writings that are kind of parallel to the Arcades project, like the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Now, we looked at the Valeret epigraph to the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. Did we also look at the first part and the last part? Did we look at the prologue and the epilogue to that? We did not. Okay. We might do that. But historically, here, we have, it covers a number of months and years, the conversations with Brecht. But really, we're thinking about the 1930s. So, let's start with our socialism or barbarism moment, which is World War I, and the revolutions that follow. So we have revolutions in Russia, Germany, Hungary, Italy, and of course the Russian Revolution survives, which creates some problems, we might say, for thinking about history, historical progress. The German Revolution is defeated. The Hungarian Revolution is defeated. The Italian uprising that takes place is also put down by fascism, by the Mussolini. Hungary, we've talked about Lukács. Lukács has been a kind of a presence in the background that is mentioned here in the conversations with Brecht. Lukács participated in the Hungarian Workers' Council's brief revolutionary government of 1919, and then wrote History and Class Consciousness, which converted Benjamin to Marxism. And not Benjamin alone, but others were influenced by Lukács. Generally people who then Lukács turned against those people who had been influenced by History and Class Consciousness to become Marxists. Okay, so 1924, Lenin died, and Stalin declared socialism in one country. So, because the idea was that this was a world revolution that had broken out of World War I. So, for instance, Lenin, his entire strategy in 1917 was predicated on the idea of a revolution in Germany. So in Germany in 1916, there was a division that took place. The Social Democrats had supported the war in World War I out of defense against Russia. So they took advantage, the German government took advantage of a statement made by the longtime leader of the German Social Democrats, August Bebel, who died in 1913. He said, not one man or one penny for this rotten system, but if it's against Russia, I myself will pick up the gun. Because Russia was Tsarism, Russia had been associated with reaction in Europe since 1848. Russian troops had literally occupied Eastern Europe to put down revolutionary uprisings in 1848. And also the Tsarist regime was complicit with other regimes in Western Europe, like the British, the French, the Second Empire, and others. So the Tsarist secret police operated throughout Europe and helped support the right throughout Europe. Sorry if this resonates today, because I think the right in Europe is blamed on Russia today, like Viktor Orban or whatever. I mean, it's like, yeah. So not to be anti-Russia or something, but Russia was, represented reaction. So out of fear of Russian invasion and the destruction of the workers' movement for socialism in Germany, the SPD adopted a national defense policy of supporting the war effort. In France, at the outset of World War I, Jean Jaurès, who was the longtime, very charismatic leader of the French Socialist Party, was assassinated by a French nationalist, like right before the war broke out, because these are people who had pledged to prevent a European war by launching a civil war of the working class to overthrow capitalism. That was the promise of the Second International, the Socialist International. Jean Jaurès was killed, August Bebel died right before the war, and then they were kind of blackmailed into supporting the war effort in Germany, and because Germany was fighting not only against Russia, but also did a blitzkrieg against France, the French socialists also supported their government out of national defense. The only parties of the old Socialist and Second International that still stood against the war and took a defeatist line towards their own governments were the Russian party, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, the Serbian party, if you guys know, Serbia was the flashpoint for World War I, and also the American Socialist Party, the Socialist Party of America, which it was easy for them to take that position in 1914 because the U.S. didn't involve themselves until 1917 directly. Okay, so Rosa Luxemburg, I think that we've mentioned her before. She's going to come up in next week's readings. And by the way, Lukács considered himself to be a student of the Marxism of not only Lenin, but also Rosa Luxemburg, and of course Marx and Engels themselves. She was the great kind of charismatic but also intellectual leader in the German Social Democratic Party. Her group broke away from the mainline party, and she wrote in 1915 that the betrayal of Marxism by the Social Democrats was like a world historic catastrophe, and so she invoked this phrase from Engels, socialism or barbarism. And she said, if in case we didn't know what barbarism was, this war shows the barbarism of capitalism. So nonetheless, she's killed in the revolution. She's killed, and she's a martyr of the revolution. But that division that occurred within German social democracy in 1916, the workers went out on strike against the war effort because they were being squeezed too much in 1916. And when that happened, Lenin wrote an article. He said, "The world revolution has begun." So when there was a division that happened within the German Social Democrats in 1916, he said, "The world revolution has begun," so that when the Tsar fell in Russia in 1917, in February of 1917, and I don't know if you guys know your history with this stuff. So when did the protests break out in Russia that brought down the Tsar? It was International Women's Day. It's the February Revolution, but that's because they're on a different calendar. It's actually March, in the same way that the October Revolution is actually November. But International Women's Day, which was an invented holiday by the Socialist International. So it was a socialist holiday that brought down that brought out protests against the war in Russia that brought down the Tsar. And the idea was that Lenin thought that taking power in Russia would be inspirational for revolution in Europe, which it was, because in fact it was on the year anniversary of the Russian Revolution of October 1917, actually November, that the November Revolution in Germany took place in 1918. That brought down the Kaiser. And it looked like it was, had some possibility of spreading, like I said, there was Hungary, Italy, etc. Nonetheless, that didn't happen. So Stalin, who took over after Lenin, declared that Soviet Union was not going to, or the Workers' Council Republic, that's what USSR stands for, the Union of Workers' Councils Republics. That's what the Soviet means council. We're not waiting for a revolution in the West anymore. We have to try to build socialism on our own, which is, of course, a kind of an absurd idea, but nonetheless, that's what happened. And there was a consolidation of a kind of one-party dictatorship, bureaucratic state in the 1920s. Now, nonetheless, that was kind of a somewhat liberal period in the Soviet Union between 1924 and 1928. It's the period of the new economic policy, where they had a lot of foreign trade and a lot of foreign capital investment, and they allowed for small proprietorship kind of capitalism within the Soviet Union. But the Great Depression crash brought an end to that. So it dried up sources of international capital and international trade, and that's when they did the 5-year plan. So they did the 5-year plan as a response to this crisis. So kind of picking up after the 5-year plan here, 1934. Also, it just so happened that the Nazis take power in 1933 out of the economic and political crisis of the Weimar Republic that also ensues out of the Great Depression. So if you guys know this history at all, but maybe you don't. So Germany was blamed for World War I. They were subjected to a punishing reparations regime in the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France had bankrupted themselves during World War I, and so they owed the United States a lot of money. And then the Germans were made to pay the British and French so that the British and French could pay the United States. And the United States, which actually did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles because they thought it was too punishing to the Germans, they loaned money to the Germans so that the Germans could pay the British and the French, so that the British and the French could pay the Americans. And so they set up this system that got them through the 1920s until the stock market crash of 1928, and then that broke down. That whole system broke down. And it affected Germany and the Soviet Union, as well as Europe and the United States, and the world. It was a global depression. At that time, both the Social Democrats and the Communists thought that the Great Depression would lead to socialism. Would lead to socialism instead of led to Nazis. Right, so economic crisis does not lead to socialism. It leads to fascism. So, 1928 is around the time that Benjamin came up with his idea for the Arcades Project. Because he was looking at the history of the 19th century as foreshadowing the history of the 20th century. So just as the 1848 revolutions failed and produced the Second Empire, Bonapartism, the failure of the World Revolution led to Bonapartism, namely fascism, and Nazism, which is just Mussolini fascism, but also Stalinism. Right, so the unifying idea, what Marxists called fascism and Nazism and Stalinism, I called it Bonapartism. That's where Trotsky comes in. So generally, the Marxists called fascism and Nazism Bonapartism. Trotsky also included Stalinism in that. And Bonapartism is not like, it's not Napoleon Bonaparte. So there's a liberal definition of Bonapartism. That's that it's a great man leader, like a strong man, right? Bonapartism in the Marxist sense is Louis Bonaparte. So not Napoleon Bonaparte, but Louis Bonaparte. And that's where it's not about the figure, the strongman leader, it's about the state. It's about the totalitarian state, the bureaucratic state, the police state. So if we recall back to the Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire that we read, the long essay by Benjamin, he talked about Louis Bonaparte being this kind of shadowy figure, and really no one can quite understand or kind of penetrate what the actual regime is about, because it seems like he's in charge, but it also seems like he's not in charge, right? So it seems like, and it blends into the conspiratorial milieu of the socialist left of the time. So Blanqui, Auguste Blanqui, is a famous revolutionary conspiracist, and that Louis Bonaparte comes out of this very same revolutionary conspiracy milieu of the 1840s. And just to remind you guys, Louis Bonaparte called himself a socialist. He was a Saint-Simonian socialist, so he was a utopian socialist. And also, Louis Bonaparte famously said, "I'm not a Bonapartist," meaning he recognized that his followers, the Bonapartists, he's like, "Yeah, I actually am not. I'm a socialist."
Subscribing to that yet.
Huh?
I'm not subscribing to that.
Yes, right. Because he thought of himself as a socialist. And also he thought of himself as having to make compromises with people that he didn't agree with in order to have his regime. I should also say Trotsky was kicked out of the Soviet Union in 1928. right? So Trotsky was marginalized from the leadership after Lenin's death. Lenin tried on his deathbed, in his convalescence, in his sickbed, he tried to work with Trotsky to keep Stalin from taking power. But Trotsky got cold feet and basically was afraid of exposing himself too much, and so he refused to cooperate with Lenin to get Stalin out of his position. But anyway, and then regretted it later. What else? What other background? Oh, of course. Let's bring it over to the 30s. I guess we have not talked about this. Yeah, we did, because we talked about this with Nadler, with Andre Breton. So, World War II. So World War II, which you could say started in 1936 because of the Spanish Civil War and also because of the Italian invasions of Ethiopia and Libya and the expansion of Japanese military invasion of China. So that's really when World War II begins, is 1936, and there is briefly the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Uh, 1939, 1940, where they have a non-aggression pact and they basically divide Poland, and the Soviet Union also invades the Baltic states and Finland. And then, of course, Hitler turns on Stalin with Operation Barbarossa. It's like some kind of Wagnerian idea, right? And invades the Soviet Union. And then the Soviets resume their alliance with the United States, France, and the UK that they had before the Hitler-Stalin Pact. 1936, purge trials. So the purge trials take place in 1936, and a lot of it comes with sort of building up to this because of the disaster of the 5-year plan. So people have to be blamed for the disaster of the 5-year plan. The Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, right, total disaster, and also politically manipulated. So it was an actual famine, but also the Stalin regime also manipulates it for political advantage to try to suppress potential Ukrainian aspirations for independence. Someone has to be blamed. So they have the purge trials. And so the idea is that the old Bolsheviks were somehow internal saboteurs of the Soviet Union. Right? That they were actually all working with Hitler and Mussolini or others. And so the purge trials were this kind of horrific event that took place and that shook the international communist movement of people like Brecht. Benjamin is a little bit more politically distant than Brecht is. Brecht is a bona fide communist party member. Benjamin is not. So people have to tie themselves in knots to justify the purge trials, and to, they wonder, because it's the big lie. So the idea is that the accusations are so outrageous that it's like gaslighting. It's like, well, they surely wouldn't make a total lie accusation against people, so there must be some truth to it. No, there was no truth to it. Although there are people running around, including young people today, who defend Stalinism and the purge trials. It's like a thing. It's like popular among Zoomers now. Stalinism is back. I've been debating them online kind of fruitlessly. It's Okay, children, why? Why? Why do you want to be Stalinists? Because they think that it's like anti-imperialist, it's like hardcore. They like the hardcore. They don't like the soft core. They don't like Zoran Mondan. Too soft core. They want hardcore. Right? Wasn't there a Bernie bro during the primaries who was caught on video saying that Republicans would have to be put in the gulag? Do you remember this? Because the Project Veritas, there's like these right-wing people who try to get leftists on tape, like embarrassing themselves or whatever. And I think that they got some like Bernie canvasser in the Iowa caucuses saying, yes, of course we will have to send the Republicans to the gulag, like they did in the Soviet Union.
I met him.
You met that dude?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah.
Were you there?
Not when he said that, but afterwards when he was getting like harassed. He was in Lansing. And,
Michigan.
Yeah, he was like staying at a friend's house who was like helping coordinate for the Marine
Was it
volunteers.
Michigan or was it Iowa? It was Michigan.
He was in Iowa, but then they were coming back to canvass because that was like one of the next primaries. And so he was at a friend's house and he was like really freaking out the whole time.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, children, be careful when you get politically involved because it's like you're putting yourself out there. No, it's a problem. There's that kid, and then there's the other kid, the Trump kid, who's like, Trump is the completion of the system of German idealism. Do you know that one? Huh?
I said, or you could end up like Dasha.
Dasha, yeah.
That's how.
Red Scare?
Her claim to fame was being on those videos.
Yeah, that's right. Oh my goodness, yeah.
She was just re-canceled.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, it'll last like 5
All right.
Re-canceled.
So, I don't know if you guys posted any notes on the conversations with Brecht. No. Is that right? Oh no, you do. Okay, you do, actually. All right. So, all right, so Brecht is obviously one of Benjamin's important interlocutors as far as Marxism is concerned. He's not exactly a mentor to Benjamin, but Benjamin respects him as a Marxist. And so, but what we get with the conversations on Brecht is some of their friction, some of their, and also, I guess, what we would consider to be confessions from Brecht about like his private thoughts as opposed to his public pronouncements. All right, so, and they talk about the author as a producer. That's one of the things that they discuss in the conversations in Brecht. It's where the conversation with Brecht began. The author as a producer, which is Benjamin's very important essay. It's in Reflections on his understanding of the role of intellectuals, including writers and artists, in the struggle for socialism. So, what is the actual role and purpose? And so, again, the author as producer is the idea that rather than thinking of oneself as a bourgeois intellectual who's on the side of the working class in its struggle for socialism, rather to think of the intellectual thinking of themselves as a producer. In other words, as themselves producers, as workers. So intellectual work. And that would be the basis of solidarity with the working class, would be as a producer. Although, of course, intellectual production is different from manual labor, physical production.
Can I ask more about
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
idea?
Yeah.
Because I haven't read that text, but how would he argue that? Like, isn't that like a simulation, like cosplaying to be a proletarian? I mean, because
You can. You can end up doing like a cosplay, yeah.
Yeah,
In
because
other words-
that's why I think Brecht did.
Yeah, poor
but,
Brecht. Yeah, a little bit.
But then how does Benjamin argue that you can be a producer as a bourgeois intellectual and then have sympathy and solidarity with the proletariat?
Okay, so first I guess we have to argue maybe from basic points, which we've talked about, which is that everything is bourgeois
Yeah, I know what
ideology.
you're gonna say.
Everything is bourgeois ideology, like absolutely everything is bourgeois ideology. The working class is bourgeois, period. Okay, so what we're talking about is the proletarianization of bourgeois society, which obviously impacts people differentially, but nonetheless is the overall case. So what this means is, and Trotsky is raised here, and I think that we've talked about this previously. So Trotsky had a thesis in 1923, Literature and Revolution, where he made the argument that there's no such thing as proletarian art and literature. There's only bourgeois art and literature. When workers become artists or writers or intellectuals, when workers become intellectuals, they do so according to bourgeois intellectual forms. So everything is bourgeois ideology, including, most importantly, the struggle for socialism itself. So Marx and Engels from the 1840s, from their earliest works, critiqued, not criticized or opposed, but critiqued socialism and communism as bourgeois ideology, meaning as continuing the revolutionary ideology of the bourgeois revolution, so the French Revolution in particular. And so that's inevitable, that's like the case, and so the only thing that can be done is to be aware of that and be aware of the self-contradictions of that. So where Marx began was looking at the self-contradictions of socialist ideology. And understanding that basically the Marxist program is a program of taking up the opposite sides of the socialist movement, meaning taking up the concerns of both the anarchists and the statists. So not choosing, like, okay, we have to be anarchist socialists or we have to be statist socialists, but understanding the authenticity and legitimacy of both sides of that division, and also individualism and collectivism. I think we've talked about that. So the fact that there were individualistic socialists as opposed to collectivistic socialists, right? So Marx, as a Hegelian, adopted the both and neither approach to these things. So the divisions within the socialist movement, the idea is that both and neither are true. Okay, so what does that mean in terms of intellectual production? So what it means is that you only have bourgeois production, but in crisis in capitalism, and that includes intellectual production. So when we talked about Brecht is doing two things at the same time. He's trying to act against and produce in such a way his dramaturgy, not just his writing, but the way he stages his plays, the way he directs his actors to perform in his plays, are meant to overcome some manifest liabilities of what bourgeois drama had become. So it was impossible to do Shakespeare in capitalism in the same way that you get Ibsen as like the attempt to do Shakespeare but in the capitalist era, but it ends up being a kind of aestheticization rather than an actual enlightenment about society. So recall what the point of Brechtian drama is. It's to enlighten us to society as opposed to aestheticizing it. On the one hand. On the other hand, Brecht is also trying to preserve this bourgeois desideratum of drama as an art form. In other words, by saying art should be enlightening, that's actually a bourgeois desideratum. That's a bourgeois criterion. And so Brecht's plays are, self-contradictory. They are, in this respect, antinomical and require a dialectical approach to understand their meaning. Now, why that's important is that, of course, Brecht himself doesn't see it this way. Brecht himself doesn't see it this way. Brecht himself thinks that his alienation effect or estrangement effect, that his dramaturgy is like the cure to the fetishization or reification of bourgeois forms in art. So Brecht thinks that his plays are the cure to bourgeois ideology, rather than being an expression of it. So we've talked about it also in terms of modernism. That Benjamin is trying to grasp the critical character of modernism rather than opposing it as bourgeois decadence. So Brecht would be among the Marxists who is opposed to modernism as bourgeois decadence. And he was trying to do something other than modernism, and that's why Brecht condemns Kafka as a bourgeois decadent, as a modernist writer. Because modernism reifies. Right, so we've talked about this previously, that Brecht's entire kind of purpose through his literary criticism and more broad aesthetic criticism is to try to get at the critical character of reification rather than treating reification as just bad. So we've had various thought figures on reification, action becoming an image. It's based on the Marxist idea of commodity fetishism. Reification in that view is when a process becomes a thing. Right, so a kind of naive metaphysics in which what is actually a process appears to be a thing. And again, what Brecht tries to do is write and direct, stage his plays in such a way as to resist reification. However, Benjamin thinks actually in trying to resist reification, they instantiate reification. And they instantiate reification actually in a way that's very parallel to what would appear to be the opposite of Brecht, namely Kafka or Proust. So critical reification. Right, so keep in mind what reification means. It's sort of process becoming the thing. Because it's thingification. Right, so there is a kind of ontological kind of approach to dialectics that Marxism can fall into, which is some kind of assertion of like a Heraclitus kind of pre-Socratic philosophical position. Everything is always changing, everything's in flux, things are changing all the time, right? Endless change. And so if we keep in mind, we've had what critical reification might be, the dialectical image. So action becoming an image. And this is, again, with respect to process becoming a thing, commodity fetishism. Marxist commodity fetishism, which, did we look at the passage from the fetishism of commodities? We did, yes, with Phantasmagoria. Right, so where relation between people takes on the form of a relation between things. But that's not like a mistake, right? So the idea is like, oh, don't relate to people through things, relate to people as people. No. It's not like a moral injunction, like don't commodify, don't fetishize commodities. No, we are products and participants in commodity fetishism inevitably. That's what we do. We treat each other as things. We ourselves have become things. The relation between people takes the form of a relation between things, meaning it is a relation between things. Capitalism reifies, and we have to overcome capitalism from within reification, not through some ethical position outside of reification, which doesn't exist. Very important. Right, so it's not like, oh, don't fetishize, don't commodify. No. It's in and through commodity fetishism, in and through reification, that capitalism has to be overcome. Right, this is, again, a dialectical or critical approach to reification that Benjamin is trying to establish through his literary and more broad cultural art criticism. Now, reification also has this character, and we've touched on this, but not quite, and we'll get there very explicitly next week, which is the idea of dialectics at a standstill. So why? Well, because dialectics is bourgeois society. So, as Marx put it, the Hegelian dialectic is a metaphysics of labor. So it is, like, bourgeois social relations are dialectical. Labor is dialectical. The social relations of labor are dialectical. This society keeps itself going dialectically. Capitalism is dialectical. Capitalism maintains itself by functioning dialectically. But capitalism is self-contradictory because it's both dialectical and the freezing of the dialectic at the same time, the congealing of labor into things. But it's really doing that. In other words, it's not like, oh, don't do that. Don't congeal labor into things. It's actually doing that. Right. So what this means is that dialectics itself dialectical image and dialectics at a standstill are self-contradictory. So what we're getting at is a dialectic of the dialectic, or what Adorno calls negative dialectics. Because Adorno is Benjamin's only student, and this is where his craziness comes from. Right, so the idea is that capitalism is dialectical, so that means there isn't a dialectical solution to capitalism, because the dialectic keeps us within capitalism. So the goal is to both fulfill and abolish the dialectic. Overcoming capitalism means completing and abolishing the dialectic. The issue is, how does this phenomenally appear? How does this task manifest, not only in the economic realm, but also in the political realm? So we've reified politics, and in the cultural and aesthetic realm.
Yeah. Just like to this question, can we say that in all these texts that were in reading today, like this contradiction manifests itself in the idea of dream?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because right now I'm reading like a report from Conversations with Brecht.
Mm-hmm.
When Benjamin discussed how Brecht perceives Kafka,
Mm-hmm.
and on page 205, yeah, the very bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what seized him was fear of end-colony state, how people become estranged from themselves by forms of their communal life, and certain forms of estrangement he foresaw. For example, the procedure of GPU. He did not foresaw find a solution and did not wake from his nightmare. Of Kafka's position, Brecht says it is that of someone vague and dreamer. Right? Like so, and then in letters that Adorno write, like he criticizes this idea of
The dream image, yeah.
Yeah.
Each epoch dreams is the one to follow.
Yeah,
Right, because then Adorno's like, yeah, but what if the dream is a nightmare, and what if that's the exact problem, right? And so how do we, because Adorno's criticisms of Benjamin are usually taken in the wrong spirit, so it's usually taken as like two different positions, but really it's Adorno saying, the way you're writing it, you're not doing justice to your own argument. In other words, Adorno is sort of pushing him, because he's like, look, I know what you mean, but no one else is going to know what you mean. And actually, that's true. Turns out that people have not understood Benjamin. And they've misunderstood him in precisely the way that Adorno feared.
But can we say that here Brecht is also kind of critical towards Kafka and saying Adorno's and Brecht positions somewhat similar?
Yes, very similar. That's right. Although Brecht didn't like Adorno, and Adorno thought that Brecht was a bad influence on Benjamin, not in the sense of changing Benjamin's ideas, but rather that Adorno thought that Benjamin adopting Brechtian strategies in his writing didn't work. Right, so that's the other difference. Because actually, Adorno appreciated Brecht and thought his work was important, but he also thought that Brecht didn't do justice to his own work. So Brecht's explicit articulations didn't do justice to Brecht's own accomplishment in his work. Right, so there's always that issue of theory and practice. So Brecht was better in practice than he was in theory. Because again, in theory, he posed it as the cure to reification. Right, whereas the point is, no, it's an instantiation, it's a critical instantiation of reification. It's not the opposite of reification. That's right. By the way, this guy Karl Korsch, who's mentioned, he is a contemporary of Lukács, and they had a point of contact even though they didn't know each other. They both wrote works in 1923 that were about recovering the Hegelian aspect of Marxism. So Korsch wrote an essay called Marxism and Philosophy. In 1923, Lukács' History and Class Consciousness. They cover a lot of the same ground, even though they came to it independently. And then Korsch was the person who Brecht chose as his mentor in Marxism, and he did that to be deliberately heterodox because Korsch had broken with the communist movement in about 1926. So Lukács turned against his own earlier work, and also Korsch turned against his earlier work. And they both turned against their earlier work as idealists, and both tried to move in a materialist direction. For Lukács, that meant reconciling to Stalinism, and for Korsch, it meant rejecting the communist movement and adopting like a left communist or council communist, and eventually an anarchist position. Right, where he decides that actually the Hegelianism of Marxism is what's wrong with Marxism. Because it ends up being idealistic and ends up being too connected to the bourgeois revolution and ends up being too much in the Jacobin tradition. And he understood the Soviet Union and Stalinism as a kind of Jacobinism. And as we know, Napoleon Bonaparte was a Jacobin. So that would include, like if Stalin's like a Napoleonic figure, that would be seen as this kind of Jacobin tradition. And Hegel is associated with that in terms of like statism, basically. So Hegelianism in the socialist movement was generally associated with statism, with a kind of justification of the state. So anyway.
How would the state perceive Hegelianism? Like someone that directs this spirit?
That embodies the spirit.
Uh-huh.
In other words, it's part of the right Hegelian as opposed to left Hegelian idea. So the right Hegelian idea is that everything happens for a reason. It's very theological in that way, meaning if something happens historically, it must be justified. It's what Trotsky called Stalinism. He called Stalinism worshipping of the accomplished fact. Worshipping of the accomplished fact. meaning if the Bolsheviks are still in charge of the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union must still be socialist. No, that's not how history works, right? And especially, literally like 90% of the original Bolsheviks were killed in the Birch trials. It was a generational turnover, though. What they said was that they had to put an end to the stinking emanations of the past. Meaning, because the old Bolsheviks had predated the revolution, they were corrupted by capitalism. And so the only way to get rid of capitalist influence was to kill off that generation and only have people who had been raised under the revolution. It's very Khmer Rouge-esque. Old, and like the Cultural Revolution, old people are bad. Old people are bad because they're corrupted by the old society that we're trying to overthrow. So that's obviously insane. And obviously capitalism does that. Capitalism is also about generational turnover, doing away with old people because they're obsolete. Okay, so, yeah. This is an important part. The fear of the ant colony state. Right, so alienation is not just a function of individualism. It's not just a function of atomization, but alienation can be collectivism, too. Of course it is collectivism. So capitalism is both individualism and collectivism. So a lot of the assumptions that we have about socialism and capitalism is individualism, socialism is collectivism, that's not the Marxist understanding at all. At all. At all. The Marxist understanding is that society is both individual and collective in character. Capitalism is a form of reified individuality and reified collectivity that takes the form of individualism and collectivism, but it's both. And so it will look like freedom is taking one side against the other side. But in fact, unfreedom is on both sides. Now, I want to say something about this, the GPU. So obviously the totalitarian police state of the Soviet Union, remember what Kafka said. So it's shabby, it's sordid, it's corrupt, right? So our notion of totalitarianism is some kind of like smoothly functioning machine in which everything is monolithic. That's actually not what totalitarianism is at all. Totalitarianism, it means corruption. It means unaccountability, and it means this Kafkaesque universe in which you don't know what people's motives are. And that goes back to the Second Empire. So if we go all the way back to Benjamin's Paris of the Second Empire and Baudelaire, that who's a police agent, who's a revolutionary, actually they're often the same people, right? Because often the state is actually fomenting the revolutionary conspiracies. Right, so recently we had this, right? So in the war on terror, after 9/11, right, they tried to root out all the Islamic terrorists in the United States. It turns out there weren't that many, and so they had to make them, they had to produce them. They had to send the FBI out to recruit Muslims to becoming terrorists so that they could arrest them. Including, sometimes the state produces terrorists who actually do terrorist acts. Right? And that happened not in the Soviet Union, in the Russian Empire. Before the revolution, in Russia, the Tsarist police state infiltrated the left, and specifically the Narodniks and the socialist revolutionaries. And then the bureaucrats would be fighting with each other within the state for influence, and sometimes they would be cultivating terrorists and send those terrorists to assassinate their rivals in the state. Yeah, talk about Kafkaesque. Absolutely, that's what it is. So in other words, it's not unique to the Soviet Union or Nazism. It's a general feature of the state in capitalism, not Bonaparte. So you can have extreme forms of this, but it's also just part of what the state becomes in capitalism. So that's important. In other words, Bonapartism is alienated politics. And it's the state as an expression of the alienation of society. So it's the state as a phenomenon, a symptom of the self-alienation of society. It's different from the Hegelian idea. The Hegelian idea is that the state is the objectification of society. In other words, that the society has to represent itself, and it does so through the state. That's different from the Marxist idea that the objectification becomes an alienation, or becomes a reification. Whereas Bonapartism is a kind of reified state. The state is an end in itself, as opposed to the state serving a purpose. So that's the idea. The idea is that actually these regimes in the communist countries are not really about pursuing socialism, but just keeping themselves in power. Which means having to do certain things, pretending to be socialist, you have to sort of keep up the pretense, including to themselves. Maybe they themselves think of themselves as socialists. It doesn't matter. It's become a means-ends reversal, where the purpose is to perpetuate the state, not to achieve socialism.
I'm just trying to reach for myself like our last reading of Nietzsche and Eternal Return. Yeah, this like the constant idea that okay, we had similar situation with Bonapartism, now socialism, and now like you had some examples of recent history. Yeah, so can we say that Benjamin still remains Nietzschean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So basically what we have with, we're going to have it a little bit in the reading that we did for today, as well as in Convolute D from last week. What Benjamin tries to do is grasp the truth of Nietzsche, which is not necessarily the same as the way Nietzsche himself understands or explains, right? So Nietzsche, I think that we talked about this with respect to Heidegger, who's a Nietzschean, that it's like the West, it's Western civilization, it's something that goes back to Socrates and Christianity and the slave revolt and morality, so it's very nebulous, right? Whereas the Marxist understanding is, well, actually Nietzsche is describing something that is the case very accurately, but it's really capitalism. It's not thousands of years of Western metaphysics or the Judeo-Christian tradition or Western civilization or whatever. Like that's, of course there's continuity from the ancient world to the modern world, but still the way we're experiencing it is much more specific. So it's a 19th century thing, it's not a thousands of years thing, right? Because Heidegger famously said, it took thousands of years for us to end up in this trap that we've created for ourselves, and it will take us thousands of years to get out of it. No, Marxism doesn't look at it that way, because Marxism is about a much tighter time horizon. Now, on the eternal return of the same, let's be careful about that. So remember what the eternal return, what the parable is about. It's about the necessity of the present. So it's actually a restatement of Hegel. So Hegel, in dealing with his romantic contemporaries, was arguing for the necessity of history even when history seems to go wrong. So it looked like the French Revolution went wrong. And it either went wrong with the Jacobin Terror or it went wrong with Napoleonic conquest and the Napoleonic system in Europe that the people then revolted against. There are various ways of thinking about how the French Revolution went wrong. And instead, Hegel said, no, it's not helpful to think about it in terms of what went wrong. It's rather important to grasp the necessity of what happened. And the necessity of what happened, not to ratify it or affirm it, but rather to recognize the task that's expressed in what happened. So he basically thought, yes, the Jacobins misrecognized what they were doing, but then he said, actually, when have historical actors ever not misrecognized what they were doing? Actually, all historical actors ever have misrecognized the actual content of what they were doing. And so the way we overcome those misrecognitions is to go through them. And then we recognize, oh, actually, it wasn't what we were doing. And then that gives rise not to the truth, but to a new misrecognition. And so it will be endless misrecognitions. So we will always misrecognize what we're doing. Now, Marxism agrees with that, but not in the Hegelian sense of post festum or ex post facto retrospective view, owl of Minerva flying at dusk. Like, so we know now how people in the past misrecognized what they were doing, but rather Marxism is concerned with how we have to struggle for freedom now, in and through our misrecognition of reality. So we can't step outside of commodity fetishism, because to do so, Lukács said, in History of Class Consciousness, would be tantamount to thinking that you've already overcome it. And we have not. Right? So obviously vulgar Marxism thinks that it's like the scales have dropped from our eyes and now we see reality as it is. No. We're in the phantasmagoria. Meaning, whatever we think we're recognizing about the truth of capitalism, it is an expression of the truth of capitalism, but it's also a misrecognition.
Our perception, which is misrecognition, as a symptom of what's going on with us.
Now, yes. And that, again, that shouldn't be despair. That should be, in other words, we're going to be doing that no matter what. And there are different forms of misrecognition. Obviously, the Nazi form of misrecognition is more absurd and delusional. The socialist misrecognition is, in a sense, closer to the truth, which means that a more acute misrecognition in some ways, and less like delusional, less avoiding of the contradiction than the Nazis. Because obviously the Nazis turned into like a cultural thing. Judaism versus Aryanism. Like, obviously that's blatantly delusional and ideological. So by comparison, socialism is more sober, but still misrecognized. We read the Benjamin, the positive concept of barbarism, the experience of poverty. He said we need a new positive concept of barbarism. Right? And then he said Brecht is one such person, and we read the destructive character, and I said that's Brecht, right? Meaning that it's true and it's not true. Meaning it's true, it's necessary, but it's also not like to be hypostasized as like a great virtue, or like the future is just going to be. I think we talked about the method of method of world politics, which is nihilism. So method is different from like principle or virtue. So it's not like we have to embrace the virtue of nihilism. No, we have to accept the method of nihilism because capitalism is nihilism, and we are participating in it. That's right. So this eternal return of the same is amor fati, love one's fate, to embrace the necessity of the present. Because if we had to do it all over again, we would probably do it the same way, and so we might as well deal with the way it's actually happened already. Right? As opposed to this kind of melancholic, like if it had only been otherwise. Well, we can't do that, and so again, the Nietzschean idea is, fuck it, I'm not going to be depressed. I'm going to embrace my shitty life, right? And so, I'm not going to think about what could have happened otherwise, because everything that happened made me who I am, and I have to love myself, Nietzsche, right? So obviously, Benjamin wants to know what the rational content of that is. And also, it helps that Nietzsche thinks that one has to embrace what one is in order to be able to overcome oneself. So that part of it is still important. meaning one has to embrace capitalism in order to be able to overcome it. We read the Surrealism essay where he said no faith in European humanity, no faith in freedom and culture and whatnot. He says only faith in the peaceable construction of the Air Force by E.G. Farben. Right? In other words, only faith in capitalism. And I think that his phrase in the Experience in Poverty is an unlimited commitment to one's present reality. Right, so now the 19th century, let's talk about this, like the pathos of this idea. Like, in other words, why does Nietzsche have to tell himself this? Why does he have to say amor fati? Why does he have to say, you would do it the same way all over again? Because the 19th century was the century of progress. It was the hopeful, optimistic century. So it was the century of seemingly peaceful development. It's Pax Britannica, so after the Napoleonic Wars. And the Napoleonic Wars were extremely violent and devastating. But from 1814 to 1914, there's a good 100 years in there in which that doesn't happen. And of course, there are devastating wars. We know of them. The American Civil War, for example, a huge one. But also other wars, revolutions, uprisings, like the Taiping Rebellion, the Indian Mutiny, the Boxer Rebellion. So in India and China, there are huge convulsions that take place that are very bloody. But again, those could be chalked up to some kind of birth pang of modernity. Whereas European civilization seemed to have been able to peacefully progress. Right, so the 20th century, World War I, conventionally, the conventional historiography tells us that World War I is the thing that shatters this faith in progress. The optimism of the 19th century is shattered in World War I. It's the end of the grand illusion, right? And the 20th century is obviously a century of catastrophe, by comparison to the 19th century. Now, where Benjamin is angling with the Arcades project is to say, actually, the catastrophe was in the 19th century already. Right? In other words, you don't need World War I, fascism, the Holocaust, nuclear war. You don't need those things for it to have already been the catastrophe. Capitalism is the catastrophe. Right? So everything that happens in the 20th century is essentially what happened in the 19th century, except magnified.
Except what?
Magnified. On a bigger scale. Also, not to be anachronistic about it, because Benjamin lives into the Holocaust, but also doesn't. I mentioned the Holodomor. I mentioned the Purge trials. Obviously, there are these catastrophic. World War II, in a catastrophic sense, has already broken out in the mid-1930s. But there is this way that we make sense of history that is a kind of bad Hegelianism, which is that somehow we have to undergo these things in order to learn the lesson. Right? So we have to learn that anti-Semitism is wrong. That's what the Holocaust teaches us. And it's like, actually, no. That, there's no necessity to these things. Like, we don't, or we need, the Vietnam War to tell us imperialism is bad or something. No, these things are historically unnecessary. Meaning, this does not, to use a Hegelian expression, give us progress in consciousness of freedom. This is not, we're not learning, we're not improving, we're not progressing through these catastrophes. We're not. Clearly we're not. But the illusion that every generation has, and we'll touch on this next week, The illusion that every generation has is that those atrocities are in the past. People used to do those things because they were so ignorant and backward, but of course we would never do these things. No. We do and we will. It's continuing. It will continue to happen. Right. So it's not like, oh, surely the US would never do something like Vietnam again. Well, actually they did. The war on terror was just as bad as Vietnam. Millions of people died. They did it again. They will. It will happen. That's capitalism. Right, so faith in progress. So where do we get faith in progress from? We get it from the 19th century because it's different from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment didn't have faith in progress. We tend to collapse the Enlightenment in the 19th century, but that's a mistake. And postmodernism, right, is all about fighting the grand narrative of history, fighting against the idea of historical progress completely fighting against that, dismissing that entirely. No, the issue is we're not progressing historically in capitalism. That doesn't mean that there's never been any historical progress ever, or that historical progress is impossible. It just means that we have not been experiencing historical progress in capitalism. And we should not extend that into the past and future. We should not take the experience of capitalism and say that's true of all of history. Which doesn't mean that bad things didn't happen. So progress is not about the avoidance of bad things. It's about the meaning of bad things. It's about the result of bad things. The result, the meaning, there's not been progress. All right, so that's the issue of the 19th century. Is that the 19th century seems to have a kind of blindness that actually the Enlightenment did not have. The 18th century was not blind to itself in the way that the 19th century seems to be.
Like, in the perspective what was recently said, can you look at this quote on page 209 about the story of the next village? Somehow, I feel in the bottom, so a little bit lower.
Oh, the next village,
Yeah. The conversation concentrated at the time on the story The Next Village. Really plays it a counterpart to the story of Achilles and the tortoise, someone who composes the right from the smallest particles, living inside all incidents, will never reach the next village. Yeah, like it's basically the idea of progress. Yeah. Now, life itself is too short for such a right, but the error lies in the someone. For just the right is deceptive, so too the writer. And just as the unity of life is now done away with, so too is its brevity, no matter how brief it may be. This makes no difference because a different person from him who started the ride arrives at the village. For my part, I give the following interpretation. The true measurement of life is remembrance. Yeah, and like, so like remembrance, like the antidote to this blindness of progressivism.
Right, so, okay, so let's, life is too short to reach the next village, right? And so the idea is that, of course, the person who arrives at the next village is a different person than who set out on the journey, no matter how short it is, right? Now, the pathos of it, right, so remembrance, going all the way back to Proust now, going all the way back to Proust and going all the way back to Bergson, how Benjamin interprets this, and also why we read this with the Nietzsche, that every form of remembrance is a form of forgetting, right? So memory and forgetting are inextricably tied. They're not opposites. They're the same thing, because we're talking about a form of memory and a form of forgetting. We're talking about the way we remember. the way we forget. So that's what this term remembrance turns memory into an activity. All right, so memory we might think of as a thing, but remembrance is how we're remembering. So it's an activity, it's a doing. And that, of course, when we are remembering, to use the Peter Proust phrase from last week, recovering the past in anticipation of the future. All right, so we're not just preserving something from the past, we're actively taking it up, and in so doing, we're changing it. And in taking up the past, we're changing it, and in changing it, we're producing the future. All right, so again, the idea is that we're not just crushed between past and future. It's not like the past dominates us and then the future just happens to us, but how to grasp how we are participating in this interchange of past and future in the present. All right, so remembrance, the true measure of life is remembrance. Retrospectively, it traverses life with the speed of lightning. All right, so again, what is he doing there? Next week, we will be talking about the abbreviation and condensation of time. As quickly as one turns back a few pages, it has gone back from the next village to the point where the writer decided to set off. He whose life has turned into writing like old people's likes to read this writing only backward. Only so does he meet himself, and only so, in flight from the present, can his life be understood. This sounds very melancholic, doesn't it? This sounds just like straight Proustian. And maybe it is. But again, we've dealt with how he's made sense of that, because he's already written the Proust essay before this. So the only hope, this gets us to the issue of redeeming the past. Right, so the way we remember, the way we objectify the past, the way we appropriate the past, the way we take it up, is also the way we might redeem it. And redemption means translating value from one form to another form. So redemption means change. It's not just the same thing. And again, the financial metaphor is important here. Right, so if you recall from experience in poverty, Benjamin gave us the idea that capitalism squanders the value of the past. So it takes the past to the pawnbroker and gets only a fraction of its value, and that the desire is to try to redeem the full value of the past. But it seems like in capitalism what we're doing is very much liquidating, without redemption, the value of the past. And that's why he also paradoxically says, okay, so we might desire more than a fraction of its value, but also seemingly, again, the destructive character, the tabula rasa, doing away with the past. Meaning, he says, mankind is preparing to outlive culture, if need be. And culture is, of course, the past. Right, so capitalism is two things at once. It's a perpetual present, but it's also the domination of the present by the past. So it's a kind of escape from the past, flight from the past, but it's also the domination of the past over the present. This is Marx. Marx says that with commodity fetishism, with capitalism, dead labor dominates living labor. The past dominates the present. That's the phrase that Marx uses. But the way it does so is actually seemingly resetting things constantly as a perpetual present. It's doing the tabula rasa destructive character, clearing the rubble, making way.
What thing is?
Capitalism is. Yeah. Capitalism.
At the same time, like
at the same time,
like blocking us and clearing the rubble at the same time.
Yeah. And that's the tricky part. To recognize that these forms are doing both things. That they're both negating the past and dominating the present with the past. another way of thinking about it, so we talked about this last week. So, it's the interaction of past and present that gives us the future. Okay, so that would be just like a truism, we could say. Okay, so the question is, what is capitalism? So it's it's both fulfilling the past in the present, and thereby fulfilling the present. But it's also negating the past and the present, and thereby negating the future. Right, again, the dialectics of a standstill. So the language that Benjamin uses is that it's an animal pawing in place. Right, so it's constantly moving, but constantly retreading the same ground. So it's a way of both fulfilling and negating the past, present, and future. And that leaves us in this kind of dialectics at a standstill. Okay. All right, so let's maybe start getting into the reading from this. I think that did well to catch up with what we didn't do. Finally, we'll just get to the end of the conversations with Brecht. He talks about a lot of themes that we'll come back to. But the last one. A Brechtian maxim, do not build on the good old days, but on the bad new ones. So that speaks to what we're talking about. It's not like we can go back. So we have to struggle not according to the good old days, but we have to struggle according to the bad new ones.
The bad new ones are the ones we're living today, or
Yes.
of the future?
No. What's new about the present is the only hope. Now, as it turns out, the bad new days, the good old days were the bad new days. But we look back on them as if they were the good old days, but actually they in their own moment were the bad new ones. Again, Hegel, Nietzsche, Benjamin, Marx, for that matter, capitalism generates nostalgia. It generates romanticism. It generates a desire to go back. But that's not possible. Nor is it desirable. Because, in fact, no. There's what is it? I'll find a Lenin. Lenin will help us with this one. No, I redeem Lenin. Lenin is my boy. I love Lenin. I love Lenin. I am Lenin. I am Adorno. I am Lenin. I love Lenin. Lenin gets a bad rap. Thank Lenin. Let's see if I can find this passage. Great quotation from Lenin. Oh yes. Found it. I'll send it to you guys on the canvas. Okay, here's Lenin. The bourgeoisie makes it its business to promote trusts, drive women and children into the factories, subject them to corruption and suffering, condemn them to extreme poverty. We do not demand such development, we do not support it, we fight it, but how do we fight it? We explain that trusts and the employment of women in industry are progressive. We do not want to return to the handicraft system, pre-monopoly capitalism, domestic drudgery for women. No, forward, through the trusted sector and beyond to socialism. So, and he's writing about like Gilded Age capitalism. Right? This is the rampant exploitation, the child labor, memorialized in the photographs. I'm forgetting who the photographer is. I'm always forgetting the two photographers. There are two photographers who are known for their pictures of children at the factory. Right? So it's like, yeah, we could say, oh, capitalism is so bad, look at what it does. But no. But no. Not a return. So, the bad news is, let's get our readings for today.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's like an existential question.
Yeah.
So, if everything's capitalism, and then the little we've got of communism in our world has turned into Bonapartism, right? Like the USSR and Cuba and Venezuela, I think. Then does the revolution have to be global then? Like can there exist like such a thing as communist countries when the whole world is capitalist, or so it has to be something that necessarily involves 8 billion people, right? So like.
Well, it has to involve the preponderant part of the activity of 8 billion people.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Right. So obviously.
But has this always been the case,
Yes.
or is it like a product of globalization in like 21st century?
It was always
communications
global.
and, like,
It was always global.
Yes, because
Yeah.
through colonialism and.
Not only through colonialism, but through the dynamic. Through the dynamic. Meaning that, of course, people in China in the 1700s didn't realize that what was going on in England was going to doom their future, but it was. Right, so so it was there from the beginning, because the dynamic. Meaning capitalism is a dynamic, and as soon as that dynamic came into existence, the world was going to be sucked into it. So, yeah, it's not like, and also globalization. It's a funny thing. So in the early 1800s in England, what was Germany? It was a low-wage country. So I think I mentioned that Engels was from a factory-owning family from the Rhineland. And then his family were successful enough to be able to open a factory in Manchester. And so the big threat was, if workers struggle for higher wages and shorter hours in England, then the factories will just move to Germany. Right, so that's literally what the employers said. They said, we'll move our factories to Germany. And they did, and they could. Right, so Russia was a low-wage, high-intensity manufacturing center before World War I. So the Russian Empire before World War I was a major capitalist country. It had the largest factories in the world. And so it was what China became after the 80s in recent history. Right, so this is what happens. So it's a dynamic that is capturing the future. It's constantly capturing the future because it's a dynamic. So, yeah. Venezuela's like petro-socialism, not communism. Venezuela's not, well, I mean, just get real. But if there was no oil, there'd be nothing.
Yeah.
That's like ridiculous. No, just no. Cuba is a little bit better example because it's hard to demonstrate how they did achieve what they achieved, other than through socialistic policies, socialistic measures. But of course, Cuba depends on world trade, and Cuba. So the thing is, capitalism and communism is the same thing. It's the same thing. It's the politics of it. The politics of it. So it's not some like just economic or material. No. The thing is, as long as the United States remains capitalist, the world is going to remain capitalist. That's it. The U.S. is not going anywhere. It's not in decline. It's not going anywhere. It's not. That's not. We're living through another renewal of American capitalism. That's what's happening. So until that changes, the world's going to be capitalist. That's what I think, anyway. Because I think we've had 100 years of Third World Revolution. It's not worked out. Now that doesn't mean that Venezuela should be attacked by the United States or something. No. I don't know that they're even going to do that. We have yet to see what's going to happen. But I don't know if they have any plans for that. I hope not. All right. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back and do exposés.
I heard you were on the crit panel of Gabrielle.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, she's in my seminar.
Oh.
And we were talking yesterday, or the day before yesterday, we were doing like a review. She told us that someone was so triggered by the sloshing sound that they had left her grid.
All right, let's resume, even though a couple of people are not back yet. All right, so I think that I might have mentioned this when we were looking at Brecht, when we were looking at Mad Love, ethnographic surrealism. So in 1935, there was a colonial exposition held in Paris, and the surrealists had a counter exhibition in which they did sort of living dioramas of like scenes from French life in the way that life in the colonies was depicted at the colonial exhibition. So the idea is turning the ethnographic gaze onto oneself, if you will. And we have an example of that in the epigraph in the 1935 version. So we have a Vietnamese poet visiting Paris. The waters are blue, the plants pink, the evening is sweet to look on. One goes for a walk, the grand dames go for a walk, behind them stroll the petite dame. Right, so again, defamiliarizing or denaturalizing, or the estrangement effect with regard to contemporary reality, or in this case, the 19th century reality. So we've looked at the 1939 revised version of Phantasmagoria in both the introduction and the conclusion. Is that right? Did we go through this? Or did we not?
No.
We did not? Oh, okay. But we somehow did look at the Phantasmagoria and the commodity fetishism in Das Kapital. Okay. Well, let's look at this. Because this is one of the main changes that occurs between the 1939 and 1935 version, is the addition of the introduction and the conclusion.
Which one's the one in Reflections?
The 1935.
Yeah, 1935.
Yeah, so the 39 version is only in the Arcades project itself. Yeah.
And which one is like the 35? Is Paris the capital?
The capital, and this is Paris capital.
Capital.
Yeah, like capital, like Das Kapital.
That's
As-
what Adorno, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, so, so let's look at the introduction. So he has an epigraph here. History is like Janus. It has two faces. Whether it looks at the past or at the present, it sees the same things. And then he goes on. The subject of this book is an illusion expressed by Schopenhauer in the following formula. To seize the essence of history, it suffices to compare Herodotus to the morning newspaper. So should we call the Karl Kraus essay? What is expressed here is a feeling of vertigo characteristic of the 19th century's conception of history. It corresponds to a viewpoint according to which the course of the world is an endless series of facts congealed in the form of things. The characteristic residue of this conception is what has been called the history of civilization, which makes an inventory point by point of humanity's life forms and creations. So this is that's a Nietzschean expression, life form or form of life. The riches thus amassed in the aerarium of civilization henceforth appear as though identified for all time. This conception of history minimizes the fact that such riches owe not only their existence, but also their transmission to a constant effort of society, an effort, moreover, by which these riches are strangely altered. So, of course, that's capitalism. Our investigation proposes to show how, as a consequence of this reifying representation of civilization, the new forms of behavior and the new economically and technologically based creations that we owe to the 19th century enter the universe of the phantasmagoria. These creations undergo this illumination, not only in a theoretical manner, by an ideological transposition, but also in the immediacy of their perceptible presence. They are manifest as phantasmagorias. Thus appeared the arcades, first entry in the field of iron construction. Thus appeared the world exhibitions, whose link to the entertainment industry is significant. Also included in this order of phenomena is the experience of the flaneur, who abandons himself to the phantasmagorias of the marketplace. Corresponding to these phantasmagorias of the market, where people appear only as types, are the phantasmagorias of the interior, which are constituted by man's imperious need to leave the imprint of his private individual existence on the rooms he inhabits. As for the phantasmagoria of civilization itself, it found its champion in Haussmann, and its manifest expression in the transformations of Paris. Nevertheless, the pomp and the splendor with which the commodity-producing society surrounds itself, as well as its illusory sense of security, are not immune to dangers. The collapse of the Second Empire and the Commune of Paris remind us of that. In the same period, the most dreaded adversary of this society, Blanqui, revealed to it in his last piece of writing the terrifying features of this phantasmagoria. Humanity figures there as damned. Everything new we could hope for turns out to be a reality that has always been present. And this newness will be as little capable of furnishing it with a liberating solution as a new fashion is capable of rejuvenating society. Blanqui's cosmic speculation conveys this lesson, that humanity will be prey to a mythic anguish so long as phantasmagoria occupies a place in it. Okay, so we did look at at the very beginning of Das Kapital, so the beginning of chapter 1 of volume 1, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of the commodity. And we've talked about the commodity form, use, value, and exchange value. Right, and we've looked at this paragraph. Okay, good. fantastic form is actually a phantasmagorical form. Now, have we talked about the phantasmagoria per se, like the smoke and mirrors? It's an English entertainment kind of carnival attraction where you are the optical illusion, the play of light and shadow is such that you're not sure whether you're seeing something in silhouette or whether you're seeing a projected shadow. So you're not sure whether you're seeing the interaction of actual objects or the interaction of objects and their shadows. So it's where we get smoke and mirrors from, that expression. So the idea is that capitalism is a phantasmagoria. So, right, so a definite social relation between men that assumes in their eyes the phantasmagoric form of a relation between things. And then to find an analogy, one would have to go to the misdeveloped regions of the religious world. And he also uses elsewhere here, he has a phrase, metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. The commodities are full of metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. Okay. Now Haussmann, we'll talk about Haussmann. So Haussmann is known for the rebuilding of Paris, the production of the boulevards. Right, so we have, over at the Art Institute Museum, we have this painting. Did we look at this previously? We have not looked at this. Okay, so this is Paris Rainy Day. This is Gustave Caillebotte. So he is one of the Impressionists, so a little bit atypical as an Impressionist painter, but nonetheless an Impressionist. So what you have here is the new streets of Paris, so the new boulevards, the new apartment blocks that were built. And there was this sort of slum clearing operation, so they got rid of old Paris and they built the new Paris, and of course this was the well-to-do section of Paris that was built this way. So we don't have to do too much of an analysis of this painting, but there's a kind of tension between stasis and motion in the painting that is produced by the symmetrical division of the painting with the oxidized copper lamppost, which in person it's a brighter green than you can appreciate here. It sort of stands out from the rest of the palette of the painting. And that's Paris Rainy Day, which means that it's depicting a situation in which you have the maximum depth of field. If you guys know about lenses and cameras, depth of field. So the ideal condition for photographing or for shooting film outside is overcast. Because if the light is too bright, then you get too much contrast, too much chiaroscuro, you get a shortened depth of field. Whereas here, you have even light and you have a glaze of water on the street that reflects the light, and so that means you get this kind of even lighting of everything, the figures and the whole scene. And you also get maximum depth of field, so you get the plunging perspective, so you can see all the way down the block, as opposed to just seeing the foreground and the rest being in shadow. Okay, so he's got another few paintings that depict these boulevards. So he's got the young man at the window. This is, huh?
Did you go to the show this morning?
I did not.
They had them.
They have this?
They had all of them.
They have all of them, that's good. All right, now is it over?
Yeah.
It's over, all right. No, because I saw some of these things in Paris, so.
Can't beat that.
Yeah, well, no, you can actually, because sometimes the exhibitions are bogus.
Also in the wall text for that painting, they said that the umbrella had just been invented. So,
The umbrella had just been invented.
For that first painting.
Right.
The new.
Newfangled technology, new trend. So just in keeping with like the Haussmann remaking of Paris, so again we've naturalized this architecture, but this would have been like brand new. This would have been like futuristic, dystopic, utopic in its time when Cariopode is making this. Right, so again, this is like a weird painting in the sense that it's inside and outside. So it's interior and exterior, and he's on the threshold, and he's looking at the woman down on the street, and there's this endless series of windows, like, and so you can imagine that in each window there's someone looking down on the street. Right, and if you're standing in the window like that, it means that you can see what's on the street, but they can't see you, right? Because it's like a dark interior, bright exterior, especially when it's, unlike the Paris rainy day, this is a clear sky, sunny day, so that would also prevent, so it's kind of this extreme voyeurism, like he can see her, but she cannot see him. And then, I like the floor scrapers, but that's not going to fit our purpose here. There's the young woman at the window. Let's see if they've got.
There's a lot of ones on like the pont, Europe or whatever. Yeah.
This is a great painting. This is a great painting. Again, this is a bridge over the rail yard in central Paris. Let's see if I can find the one I'm looking for though, because there's one that's analogous to the young man at the window, and that's the young woman. Which is kind of the opposite. World History Encyclopedia.
Are you looking for the one that's like his brother at the balcony?
No, it's this one.
Oh, okay, sorry.
This one. Yeah, the woman at the window, which is kind of the opposite of what we were just looking at with the young man at the window, which is the window is closed, and you also have the drapery, the curtains, and she's not alone, but she's under some kind of patriarchal supervision of some kind, either brother, husband, somebody. And her posture is very different, right? So she's looking out the window, but not with that confident gaze of the young man at the window. And across, you can see that there might be another woman in the window across from her, also kind of sort of behind the curtains of the window across the way. Right, so this is the sort of domestic interiority as opposed to the sort of public-private threshold. Right, even though it's the same window, it's the same architecture. All of this is important for Benjamin because he talks about the phantasmagorias of the city of Paris, but also the phantasmagorias of the interior. We've had that thought figure before, which is the macrocosm and the microcosm. All right, so humanity will be prey to a mythic anguish so long as phantasmagoria occupies a place in it. So as long as we're in capitalism, we're going to be prey to this mythic anguish. The conclusion mirrors the themes here, so let's look at this. So here's Auguste Blanqui from Eternity Among the Stars. Men of the 19th century, the hour of our apparitions is fixed forever and always brings us back to the very same ones. During the Commune, Blanqui was held prisoner at the fortress of Tourreau. It was there that he wrote his Eternity Among the Stars, or Via the Stars. This book completes the century's constellation of phantasmagorias with one last cosmic phantasmagoria, which implicitly comprehends the severest critique of all the others. The ingenuous reflections of an autodidact, which form the principal portion of this work, open the way to merciless speculations that give the lie to the author's revolutionary elan. By the way, Blanqui, so if you've heard this expression from Marxism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, Blanqui is actually the originator of that. Yeah, so pretty much everything that is associated with Marxism is something that Marx appropriated from other socialists. Right, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's from Louis Blanc. That was the socialist labor minister in the Second Republic, the provisional government, the author of the National Workshops. So Blanquis's dictatorship of the proletariat, that's what you need to know. The conception of the universe which Blanqui develops in his book, taking his basic premises from the mechanistic natural sciences, proves to be a vision of hell. It is, moreover, the complement of that society which Blanqui, near the end of his life, was forced to admit had defeated him. The irony of this scheme, irony which doubtless escaped the author himself, is that the terrible indictment he pronounces against society takes the form of an unqualified submission to its results. Blanqui's book presents the idea of eternal return 10 years before Zarathustra, Nietzsche, in a manner scarcely less moving than that of Nietzsche, and with an extreme hallucinatory power. This power is anything but triumphant. It leaves, on the contrary, a feeling of oppression. Blanqui here strives to trace an image of progress that immemorial antiquity, parading as up-to-date novelty, turns out to be the phantasmagoria of history itself. Here is the essential passage. The entire universe is composed of astral systems. To create them, nature has only 100 simple bodies at its disposal. That's the periodic table of elements. Despite the great advantage it derives from these resources and the innumerable combinations that these resources afford its fecundity, the result is necessarily a finite number, like that of the elements themselves. And in order to fill its expanse, nature must repeat to infinity each of its original combinations or types. So each heavenly body, whatever it might be, exists in infinite number in time and space, not only in one of its aspects, but as it is at each second of its existence from birth to death. The earth is one of these heavenly bodies. Every human being is thus eternal at every second of his or her existence. What I write at this moment in the cell of the fort of Cutrone, I have written and shall write throughout all eternity, at a table with a pen, clothed as I am now in circumstances like these, and thus it is for everyone. The number of our doubles is infinite in time and space. One cannot in good conscience demand anything more. These doubles exist in flesh and bone, indeed in trouser and jacket, in crinoline and chignon. They are by no means phantoms. They are the present, eternalized. Here, nonetheless, lies a great drawback. There is no progress. What we call progress is confined to each particular world and vanishes with it. Always and everywhere in the terrestrial arena, the same drama, the same setting, on the same narrow stage. A noisy humanity infatuated with its own grandeur, believing itself to be the universe and living in its prison as though in some immense realm, only to founder at an early date along with its globe, which has borne with deepest disdain the burden of human arrogance. The same monotony, the same immobility on other heavenly bodies. The universe repeats itself endlessly and paws the ground in place. In infinity, eternity performs imperturbably the same routines. So this should also remind us of truth and lie in an extra-moral sense from Nietzsche that we looked at last week. We did look at that.
Yes, we did.
Yes, we did. Okay, good. This resignation without hope is the last word of the great revolutionary. The century was incapable of responding to the new technological possibilities of the new social order. That is why the last word was left to the errant negotiators between the old and new, who are at the heart of these phantasmagorias. The world dominated by its phantasmagorias. This, to make use of Baudelaire's term, is modernity. Blanqui's vision has the entire universe entering the modernity, of which Baudelaire's 7 old men are the heralds. In the end, Blanqui views novelty as an attribute of all that is under sentence of damnation. Likewise, in Heaven and Hell, a vaudeville piece that slightly predates the book, in this piece, the torments of hell figure as the latest novelty of all time, as pains eternal and always new. The people of the 19th century, whom Blanqui addresses as if they were apparitions, are natives of this region. sections that I like to start with is the Granville. So if you guys know who Granville is, the illustrator. So he's a famous illustrator of the 19th century, so popular. He did illustrations of Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, Don Quixote, and I thought he did. Maybe not. I think they did Alice in Wonderland too. Right, so let's look at some of his works because they are tricky. Let's see what I got here. The Bridge of the Planets. So, if you recall, Benjamin talks about the rings of Saturn as if they are balconies, iron balconies. And so here, again, we have the idea that the urban architecture of the 19th century will eventually span the universe, span the cosmos. Seems like it's flipped. Maybe it's supposed to go the other way. Let's see. Oh, it's no, maybe this is correct. I thought it was flipped the other way. Okay, so here we have this kind of ballerina fairy figure, and then she's sort of spinning and out of her form is emanating all these other things. So we get, she turns into a spool of thread, her legs turn into leggings, which then become feet and hearts, and the Sacred Heart, and letters. And the hearts become grain, which become bread, which become rings, which become money. So the clapping hands, the lobster claws, the pellets that you bring the bread out of the oven with. Yeah. Right, so it's this constant transformation of forms. I think this is the Apocalyptic Ballet, is the name of this one. Ballet of the
What was the date on that?
That is from 1843.
Wow.
1843.
It's like crazy surrealist.
It is, yeah. So again, the idea being, see, it is flipped. I think it's flipped, unless there are multiple versions. Yeah, this is should be this way, not the other way. So 1843. Okay, so there's that. one that I find particularly bizarre and disturbing is this one. The Garden of Beasts. This is a great image of capitalism in the 19th century. Right, so you get these kind of molluscoid, kind of anthropomorphic forms, all looking terrified because they're about to be eaten by this sea creature. So of course this is how humanity is imagining itself in the 19th century. Let's see. Thought that there was Wikipedia. Sometimes fails us. This one. So this is the fish who are fishing people with commodities.
I remember I don't know if it's last week or the week before, you told us about zoomorphism.
Zoomorphism, yeah.
Yeah, and how this appears in Kafka, also in Nietzsche, and how it's supposed to make a human zoomorphed, like the other way. But what did you?
To bring out the animal-like character of humans.
Yeah, that. But why would you choose one before the other?
Good question, right? So here's a little hypothesis. So humanity has always been based, all cultures ever, for tens of thousands of years, been based on the distinction of the human from the animal. So what would be the meaning, we might say, of the fact that the 19th century capitalism seems to animalize humanity? So one way of thinking about it is it's in the 19th century that, as Marx put it, the meaning of human requirements is first posed as a question. Meaning, it's when they start counting calories, they start figuring out what's the minimum amount that people have to eat to survive. And it becomes like the statistical problem. So it becomes like our basic biological needs. The basic subsistence needs becomes a measure. So why is that? Because in capitalism, wage labor is driven down to that. In other words, the idea is that you have to pay people enough to survive. And that raises the question of what is survival. Meaning, I think that we had Baudelaire say that you could live 3 days without bread, but without poetry, never. Right? Which is to flip around the 19th century utilitarian kind of idea, which is figuring out what base subsistence needs are and treating everything else as extra, as like a luxury. Right? So, and this produces a kind of aesthetic, like a l'art polar response from Théophile Gautier. I think that Benjamin talks about Gautier, who said that what made art necessary was its uselessness, and indeed what makes humanity necessary is its uselessness. Meaning, whereas you can imagine that all animals fulfill a purpose within the ecology of the world, humans don't. Right? So humans are the unnecessary animals, and that's what defines our humanity. And yet, in the 19th century, we're driven to plumb the depths of our bare biological necessity. Right? So that's what capitalism reduces us to. So capitalism, for the first time, reduces humans to the animal level in a way that had not been the case previously. And not just some humans, but all humans. And indeed, even with slavery, there wasn't really a reduction of human to the animal, meaning there was more to it than that. So Aristotle famously said that slaves are tools that can speak. But they're tools that can speak. Animals can't speak. Right, so again, the idea is it's not an accident that it's in the 19th century that the meaning of human life itself comes into question in a way that had not been the case previously. Right, and that's that kind of animalization of the human, or kind of reduction of the human to the animal. Because we are animals, of course we are animals, we are. Right? But we're more than animals, and yet capitalism reduces us to our animal nature. Philosophy of aesthetics reduces us to our optic nerve and brain's response to things. Shouldn't, right? Because according to Kant, aesthetic appearance is about our freedom. It's not about our neurology. Okay, so yeah, that would be one way of thinking of it. Now, he associates this with the world exhibitions. Granville. Yes, when all the world, from Paris to China, pays heed to your doctrine, O divine Saint-Simon, so utopian socialism, the glorious golden age will be reborn. Rivers will flow with chocolate and tea, sheep roast and whole will frisk on the plain, and sautéed pike will swim in the Seine. Fricasseed spinach will grow on the ground, garnished with crushed fried croutons. The trees will bring forth apple compotes, and farmers will harvest boots and coats. It will snow wine, it will rain chickens, and ducks cooked with turnips will fall from the sky. World exhibitions are places of pilgrimage to the commodity fetish. Europe is off to see the merchandise, says Taine in 1855. The world exhibitions were preceded by national exhibitions of industry, the first of which took place on the Champ de Mars in 1798, so during the French Revolution, but after the fall of the Jacobins. It arose from the wish to entertain the working classes, and it becomes for them a festival of emancipation. The workers would constitute their first clientele. The framework of the entertainment industry has not yet taken shape. The popular festival provides this. Chaptal's celebrated speech on industry opens the 1798 exhibition. The Saint-Simonians, who envision the industrialization of the earth, take up the idea of the world exhibitions. Chevalier, the first authority in this new field, is a student of Enfantine and editor of the Saint-Simonian newspaper, The Globe. The Saint-Simonians anticipated the development of the global economy, but not the class struggle. Thus we see that despite their participation in industrial and commercial enterprises around the middle of the century, they were helpless on all questions concerning the proletariat. World exhibitions glorify the exchange value of the commodity. They create a framework in which its use value becomes secondary. They are a school in which the masses, forcibly excluded from consumption, are imbued with the exchange value of commodities to the point of identifying them. Do not touch the items on display. World exhibitions thus provide access to the phantasmagoria, which a person enters in order to be distracted. With these divertissements, to which the individual abandons himself in the framework of the entertainment industry, he remains always an element of a compact mass. The mass delights in amusement parks, with their roller coasters, their twisters, their caterpillars, in an attitude that is pure reaction. It is thus led to that state of subjection which propaganda, industrial as well as political, relies on. The enthronement of the commodity with its glitter of distractions is the secret theme of Granville's art. Once the split between its utopian and cynical elements in his work. The subtle artifices with which it represents inanimate objects corresponds to what Marx calls the theological niceties of the commodity. The concrete expression of this is clearly found in the speciality, a category of goods which appears at this time in the luxuries industry. World exhibitions construct a universe of specialities. The fantasies of Granville achieve the same thing. They modernize the universe. In his work, The Ring of Saturn becomes a cast iron balcony on which the inhabitants of Saturn take the evening air. By the same token, at world exhibitions, a balcony of cast iron would represent the ring of Saturn, and people who venture out on it would find themselves carried away in a phantasmagoria where they seem to have been transformed into inhabitants of Saturn. The literary counterpart of this graphic utopia is the work of the Fourierist savant Toussaint. So Fourier is the other major utopian socialist, Charles Fourier, as well as Saint-Simon. Toussaint was the natural sciences editor of a popular newspaper. His zoology classifies the animal world according to the rule of fashion. He considers woman the intermediary between man and the animals. She is, in a sense, the decorator of the animal world, which in exchange places at her feet its plumage and its furs. The lion likes nothing better than having its nails trimmed, provided it is a pretty girl that wields the scissors. So dialogue between fashion and death. Fashion prescribes the ritual according to which the commodity fetish demands to be worshipped. Granville extends the authority of fashion to objects of everyday use, as well as to the cosmos. In taking it to an extreme, he reveals its nature. It couples the living body to the inorganic world. To the living, it defends the rights of the corpse. The fetishism which thus succumbs to the sex appeal of the inorganic is its vital nerve. The fantasies of Granville correspond to the spirit of fashion that Apollinaire later described with this image. Any material from nature's domain can now be introduced into the composition of women's clothes. I saw a charming dress made of corks. Steel, wool, sandstone, and files have suddenly entered the vestmentary arts. They're doing shoes in Venetian glass and hats in Baccarat crystal. Okay, so the rights of the corpse. So we were talking about living labor and dead labor. So the domination of living labor by dead labor, the instant congealing of labor into a thing, so the instant sort of corpseification of the body. We read Baudelaire. He said, we, just like the ancients, we need the nude, whether in the bedroom, the bath, or the anatomy theater. Right? And I think that I mentioned to you guys, we looked at the Olympia by Manet. One of the things that the critics accused Olympia of being was corpse-like. Right? So we have to imagine why Manet would have intentionally rendered her that way. Right? Again, the homage to Baudelaire. He was taking his cue. Right. Again, the things are not outside of us, we're the things. We're the things. Now, what he's saying about Granville is that the style of illustration is the same as the style of like advertising or product catalogs, right? So this is like if the advertising or the product catalog took on a life of its own and just went into like a fugue state, this is what you get from Granville. And that's why it's like the Surrealists. It's very much like the Surrealists. And also inspirational for the Surrealists. The Surrealists love Granville, as you might imagine. So there's a style of illustration from the 19th century. Also, like medical and scientific illustration. So again, there's a kind of homogeneous style to this, and Granville is like sort of tripping on it. So one of the things that Adorno takes issue with is the iron construction. But let's think about that for a second. So did we? Look at this. Did we? Yes, we did. There we go. All right, so we looked at the Art Nouveau. Right, so the fusion of the technological and the organic. Okay, so what happens in the 20th century is that the marble facade is stripped off the iron construction. So basically you have skyscrapers are invented in the 19th century, but then in the 20th century we get the international style that removes the decorative facade, and you just get the steel and concrete and glass form unadorned, right? The sort of new matter-of-factness, the Adolf Loos enemy of ornamentation. So his idea is that the steam engine produces the locomotive, which produces the railroad track, and that once you have this kind of production, then you can use it, you can kind of extrapolate from it. You get a kind of architecture deriving from the railway station, essentially. But that it's still encased within a kind of neoclassical facade. Right, so what he's trying to do is give you the kind of confrontation of bourgeois society with the Industrial Revolution. Right, so bourgeois society imagines itself as classical antiquity reborn, right, going back to the Renaissance. That's why it's called the Renaissance, because the idea is that there's a rebirth, and what form does the rebirth take? Classical antiquity. So if you look at the style of like Republic architecture in the French Revolution, if you look at the style of Washington, D.C. in the United States, neoclassical. What's hidden within it, however, is the Industrial Revolution, meaning the iron structure, which actually allows for architectural forms that would not be the case if you were just building out of marble columns. Right, so that's what he's trying to sort of give a kind of image for here. Right, so he says, and we've talked about this before, that the empire means first empire, and the republic means the first republic. Okay, so iron construction from the time of the French Revolution. The empire saw in this technology a contribution to the revival of architecture in the classical Greek sense. The architectural theorist Baudelaire expresses a general view of the matter when he says that with regard to the art forms in the new system, the formal principle of the Hellenic mode must come to prevail. Empire is the style of revolutionary terrorism for which the state is an end in itself. So we're talking about the means ends reversal in itself. Just as Napoleon failed to understand the functional nature of the state as an instrument of domination by the bourgeois class, so the architects of his time failed to understand the functional nature of iron, with which the constructive principle begins its domination of architecture. These architects design supports resembling Pompeian columns and factories that imitate residential houses, just as later the first railroad stations will be modeled on chalets. Construction plays the role of the subconscious. Nevertheless, the concept of engineer, which dates from the Revolutionary Wars, starts to make headway, and the rivalry begins between builder and decorator, the École Polytechnique and the École des Beaux-Arts. For the first time in the history of architecture, an artificial building material appears, iron. Of course, it's not really true, but anyway. It serves as the basis for a development whose tempo accelerates in the course of the century, meaning concrete is an artificial material. Right? Iron's the first artificial material. Well, granted, it's, the development enters a decisive new phase when it becomes apparent that the locomotive, on which experiments have been conducted since the end of the 1820s, is compatible only with iron tracks. So they try to do it with wooden tracks, only with iron tracks. The rail becomes the first prefabricated, and this is what he means, iron component. So artificial means prefab. Which is the precursor of the girder. Iron is avoided in home construction to be used in arcades, exhibition halls, train stations, buildings that serve transitory purposes. At the same time, the range of architectural applications for glass expands, although the social prerequisites for its widened application as a building material will come to the fore only 100 years later. In Scheerbart's glass architecture, it still appears in the context of utopia. We've looked at that in the experience of poverty, the culture of glass, which of course we have since arrived at. Each epoch dreams the one to follow. Corresponding to the new form of the new means of production, which in the beginning is still ruled by the form of the old, according to Marx, are images of the collective consciousness in which the new is permeated with the old. These images are wish images. In them, the collective seeks both to overcome and transfigure the immaturity of the social product and the inadequacies in the social organization of production. At the same time, what emerges in these wish images is the resolute effort to distance oneself from all that is antiquated, which includes, however, the recent past. These tendencies deflect the imagination, which is given impetus by the new, back upon the primal past. In the dream in which each epoch entertains images of its successor, the latter appears wedded to elements of primal history. So he has the primal image and the primal history, the Geschichte and image, that is to elements of a classless society. And the experiences of such society, as stored in the unconscious of the collective, engender, through interpretation with what is interpenetration with what is new, the utopia that has left its trace in 1,000 configurations of life, from enduring edifices to passing fashions. All right, so I want to say something about this. So the classless society is a kind of paradoxical formulation. On the one hand, Marx and Engels famously wrote in the Manifesto that history is the history of class struggles. On the other hand, they also treat class in the modern era of capitalism as different from the structure of the past. Meaning the caste system became a class system, but not immediately. Meaning bourgeois society itself was supposed to be the classless society because it was supposed to overcome caste. It did overcome caste, but then class came back. And in some ways, capitalism is the first and only class society precisely because bourgeois society is the first classless society, at least since the history of civilization. So this is why bourgeois society has to deny that classes exist. Or if classes exist, it's a problem to be ameliorated. Caste was not like that. So caste was acknowledged, it was celebrated, and the idea of getting rid of it would have been horrific to people in traditional civilization. Whereas in bourgeois society, we're always trying to get rid of class, either through denying it or by practically overcoming it. So the fact that capitalism is a class-divided society is the contradiction. It's the self-contradiction. In a way that in feudalism, castes are not a contradiction. There's no contradiction to feudal society being a caste society, or traditional civilization being a caste society. There's no self-contradiction there. Class in capitalism is a contradiction, because it's supposed to be the classless society. In other words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all equal in those inalienable rights, liberty, equality, fraternity, French Revolution. Equality. Bourgeois society is supposed to be the society of equality. It's not supposed to be hierarchical the way traditional civilization was supposed to be hierarchical. This society is not supposed to be hierarchical. That it is a contradiction. Okay. And we also have from not just Marxism, but indeed from socialism and communism in the 19th century, this idea that there was primitive communism, that the hunter-gatherers were primitive communism. To which Engels responded that it wasn't really communism because there was still a gender division of labor, namely the hunting and the gathering. And so for Engels, he said this means that actually the hunter-gatherers, primitive communism, is actually the first class society because there's a class distinction between men and women. It's bourgeois society that posits women's equality for the first time. Right, so capitalism holds out the possibility of equality in a radical way not possible previously, and yet it also violates that promise. Now, did we talk about we haven't talked about this yet. Did we talk about the gender utopia of the utopian socialists, the sexual utopia of the utopian socialists? Okay, so the utopian socialists were all about like the phalanstery. So the Fourier had this idea of the phalanstery. So that is basically the completely organized community. And the term is from phalanx, from the Greek military unit, the phalanx. And the idea is that everything is going to be perfectly organized in order to maximize efficiency. And that includes sex. So everything is going to have like factory efficiency, including sexuality, and in a state of pure equality. And the idea is that this will produce, like this will transform human nature, and it will basically produce a hermaphroditic race in which everyone is equal sexually. So there won't be a division between who like has to do childbirth, so. Yeah. Now, are we still pursuing that? Yes, we're still pursuing that, children. We are. That's capitalism. Capitalism engenders this dream or nightmare, utopia or dystopia. Right? The pure mechanization of sex, is that utopian or dystopian? Or is it kind of both? So that's utopian socialism. Because socialism always had gender equality and sexual freedom as its goals. It always had those as its goals. Socialism always had this goal from the early 19th century. And yet, it also forecast capitalism as the dystopic version of the utopia. So Marx famously said that the socialists wanted to abolish the family. They wanted to abolish the patriarchal family. They wanted to abolish the private prostitution of women by their husbands. And he said, well, okay, if we abolish the family, then that will just introduce universal prostitution. That women will go from being the property of their husbands to being the property of the entire community. At the same time, he thought maybe this is the next stage that we have to go through. In other words, maybe we do have to do this abolition of the family in order to then get beyond that. But also famously in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote that communists are accused of wanting to abolish the family and introduce universal prostitution, but no, it's capitalism itself that does that. It's capitalism itself that does that. Right, so the basic approach to the utopian socialists, Marx and Engels, was that what the utopian socialists imagined to be emancipation beyond capitalism was actually dreaming the future of capitalism. We're running out of time. Okay. All right, what I missed talking about was the panoramas. So when photography was invented, and we didn't really get into photography in this course very much, we talked about it a little bit, but not very much. So when photography was invented, there were many contemporaneous kind of inventions. So one was that photography was not only invented as monoptical, but it was also, maybe we talked about this, the stereoscope, the stereoscopy, yeah. Like the viewfinder, that's what the kids use, right? But also, there was this new invention of a painting style, the panorama. And of course now we have like the digital panorama, right? So you can like set your smartphone to like basically produce a panorama by a series of photographs. So the idea is that it's meant to mimic peripheral vision. Have you guys ever been to a panorama in real life? Sometimes they have panoramic films at like museums. And then, I don't know if you've ever gone into one of those and they have these sort of things that you're supposed to hold on to, and it says, like, beware if you're subject to vertigo, like it might like do something to you or whatever, right? Because of course photography does not mimic our physical vision. Does not, because our vision is stereoscopic, not monoptical. It involves peripheral vision, which photography does not. So the panorama is like a kind of funny complement to photography as contemporaneous phenomena. And so they were in vogue around the time of the arcades. So the early 19th century, again, the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, towards the end of the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, is when photography was invented and when panoramas were in vogue as like a popular amusement. Yeah, panoramas. I mean, they're hard to represent, right? London, 1792. But that's all in one wall, I think. That's not actually curved, right? Where'd you find that?
I just, the German panorama.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, of course, the original panoramas were not photographs, meaning they were paintings. That's important. The cyclorama is the panoramic photograph.
I think there's a cyclorama painting in Atlanta of the Battle of Atlanta.
Oh, is there?
Yeah.
Oh, how funny.
It was made by a northerner, but no one was buying it, so they adjusted it and sold it to Atlanta.
Right. So the issue is the relationship between the panorama and history painting, because it most resembles history painting. So history painting would be installed in the interior of a public building and would be potentially panoramic, but it wouldn't be panoramic in the sense of like the single individual subject with the kind of physical field of vision. It would be more like walking around, looking at different moments in the history painting. So again, for Benjamin, the significance of the panoramas is that It's a changed relation between art and technology and a new attitude towards life. Right, so, in other words, a new kind of subjective experience. So what panoramas and photography both are expressions of is a new kind of experience, but also a crisis of experience. So I think that we've talked about that it's not just a new form of experience, but it's actually a crisis of that experience. So he understands these forms as a crisis of the bourgeois subject of experience.
Like those panoramas, particularly those in the here.
It's funny, the connection, right? So the fact that it's the same person, right?
Yeah. That he worked with, that they weren't just simply like paintings, but there was an illusion of motion in them.
Mhm.
Yeah, because of the lighting, there could be day, not light, and night light imitation.
Mhm.
So it's like,
It's the film before the film.
yeah.
It's cinema before cinema. Right, so it's aiming at a kind of cinematic experience before the technical invention of film. That helps us to, again, defamiliarize ourselves with the cinematic form and what it represents and what the experience is about. Because I don't think when they invented film, they didn't create panoramic film. That came later. Right, so, and it goes to the arcades. We've talked about this previously as interior and exterior at the same time. Right, so the fact that you would go into an arcade in order to see a panorama, it's like, well, why wouldn't you just see your external world panoramically? No, the point is you go inside in order to see the outside. Right.
It's like you logging into Netflix accounts.
Uh-huh, yeah, that's right. It's also, I think that we, in Experience in Poverty, we talked about Jules Verne, and the difference between Shearbart and Jules Verne is that Jules Verne has like the English or French gentleman like getting into the spaceship, whereas Shearbart, it's like a different life form that flies through space, right? But also, the 19th century is the invention of science fiction, and it's the invention of the imagination of space travel. Right, so again, the idea is that this isn't the imagination of space travel. This is rather how we're imagining our present existence terrestrially. We're experiencing life on Earth as if it were space travel.
Yeah, and Adorno writes about this, yeah.
That's right. All right, so next week, final week, I will see you then.